Luke Elliott stood in the stale, dusty confines of an old storage facility, the kind that held decades of forgotten memories and silent secrets. He had come to sort through the belongings of his late father, a task he had postponed for months. The air was thick, and as he shifted a heavy box, a cloud of dust spiraled into the dim sunlight seeping through a narrow window. He coughed, wiping his face with a faded sleeve, and took a slow breath. In the far corner, tucked beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers and cracked photo frames, something caught his eye, a small, ornately carved wooden box. It was out of place amid the otherwise mundane clutter. Compelled by instinct more than curiosity, Luke knelt and gently pulled it free. The wood was smooth under his fingers, the patterns intricate and unfamiliar. When he opened it, the hinge let out a soft creak, revealing a single folded piece of paper resting within. At first glance, it looked official, thick parchment, crisp edges. But it wasn't the paper that made Luke's pulse quicken. It was his own name, written boldly in black ink across the top, and at the bottom, a signature, his signature. It was a will declaring that Luke had died 3 months ago, leaving his entire estate to his wife, Emma, and someone named Ryan Wells. His thoughts faltered, the room seemed to tilt. His hands trembled as he took a picture of the document with his phone, careful not to disturb its placement too much. Returning it to the box exactly as he found it, he closed the lid and secured the latch. Every breath he took now felt heavier, more uncertain. How could such a document exist? He was very much alive, and he had never heard of this Ryan Wells. The ride home was a blur. Luke gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Their quiet suburban neighborhood looked surreal now. Every perfect lawn and trimmed hedge a mockery of the chaos unraveling in his head. Inside the house, the scent of roasted vegetables greeted him, and Emma stood in the kitchen, casually preparing dinner under the glare of the overhead lights. Her face lifted into a smile, but Luke noticed how it never reached her eyes. He didn't speak. Instead, he placed his phone on the counter, the screen displaying the photo of the forged will. The look on Emma's face shifted quickly, from surprise to calculation. Luke recognized it as the expression of someone not caught off guard, but caught early. Her reaction wasn't confusion. It was control. That moment shattered any illusion Luke still held. He no longer questioned whether something was wrong. He knew it. And if that document existed, there was more beneath the surface than he could see. He couldn't stay in the same house, not while every glance and smile felt rehearsed. Not while the knife she had been using moments ago still sat too close to her hand. He moved swiftly but quietly through the house, gathering essentials. A backpack, cash, identification, and his passport. From his small home office, he pulled hard copies of important documents, grabbed a flash drive, and copied financial files from their shared computer. His mind was racing faster than his hands, flooded with images and fragments of recent months. Things that hadn't made sense before suddenly came into focus. The late-night phone calls Emma dismissed, the sudden changes in their joint finances, her increasingly distant demeanor. Before leaving, Luke set up a hidden camera in the study, positioning it to catch anyone snooping around while he was gone. He didn't know exactly what he'd uncover, but he intended to collect every thread of truth. With the sound of running water coming from upstairs, he slipped out the door. It was late, and the street outside was quiet. As he pulled away from the house, he looked up toward the bedroom window. Emma was there, wrapped in a towel, her face rigid with fury. The image etched itself in his mind like a warning. Luke didn't know where he was going, only that he needed distance. He needed clarity. The world he thought he knew had crumbled in a matter of hours, and now, all that remained was a fierce instinct to survive and fight back. He drove for miles before stopping at a rundown roadside motel on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the entrance. Luke paid for a room using a false name and cash, asking for a week up front. The room reeked of old smoke and cheap cleaner, but it was safe, temporary, a place to breathe. Alone at last, he sat at the edge of the creaky bed, his laptop resting on his knees. He had questions, too many to answer in one night. But the first one burned brighter than all the rest. Who was Ryan Wells? The dim light of the motel room flickered softly as Luke sat hunched over his laptop, surrounded by scattered documents and coffee-stained notepads. His entire world had shifted overnight, and now, amidst peeling wallpaper and a faint stench of mildew, he was piecing together the wreckage. He began by digging into Ryan Wells, the name that had appeared on the forged will like a stain. A quick search revealed glossy magazine covers, polished interviews, and real estate accolades. Ryan was a charismatic developer, always photographed in tailored suits, flashing that polished grin reserved for politicians and predators. On the surface, he looked like a success story. But Luke knew how facades worked. He'd lived inside one for years. He dove deeper, tracing company registrations and sale records, connecting dots across cities and transactions. A pattern began to form. Ryan had a history of appearing in the lives of affluent women, many of them married, often just before their finances took a sharp turn. Lavish gifts, whirlwind romances, and then nothing. Bankruptcies, vanished savings, broken homes. It was like watching a magician work in reverse, creating wealth out of smoke and mirrors, only to steal it when no one was looking. Luke's own financial records told the rest of the story. He traced large, unexpected transfers from his joint accounts to a shell corporation buried behind layers of anonymous ownership. A little more digging confirmed it. Ryan's name was buried in the registration documents. Emma had helped siphon off the funds, piece by piece, hiding the evidence in plain sight. His stomach turned. The betrayal wasn't theoretical anymore. It was documented, quantified, complete. Luke copied everything, emails, bank statements, digital correspondence, onto multiple flash drives. He didn't know yet how deep the conspiracy went, but he wasn't going to be caught unprepared again. The laptop's glow illuminated his exhausted face, but there was no time for rest. He reached for his phone and dialed Don Harper, his longtime friend and lawyer. The call went to voicemail. "Don, it's Luke. I've uncovered something serious. I need to meet urgently. Call me back as soon as you get this." He ended the call and tossed the phone aside. It buzzed almost immediately. Emma again. The message was short. "You're overreacting. Come home and let's talk." The manipulation was evident. She wanted control, not resolution. Luke didn't respond. Instead, he opened a new document on his laptop and began cataloging everything. Not just the hard facts, but timelines, behavior changes, inconsistencies. He needed to remember it all. He couldn't afford to miss a single thread. By morning, exhaustion finally overtook him. He drifted into a fitful sleep, dreams filled with static images and fragments of laughter that didn't belong to him. A sharp knock on the door woke him. Disoriented, he grabbed his phone. It was Dawn. "Luke, I got your message. What's going on?" He explained everything, the forged will, the siphoned funds, the connection to Ryan Wells. There was silence on the other end, and then a low whistle. "This is serious," Dawn said. "We need to move quickly. First, we freeze the accounts. Then we build a legal case. But you need to stay off their radar. They can't know you're moving against them." "I understand," Luke replied. "But there's more. I think she's preparing something worse. She threatened to ruin my reputation. Accusations, maybe even fake evidence." "Then you'll need allies," Dawn said. "People who can vouch for you, back your character. Who can we trust?" Luke paused. "Miles Harper. He's my department head at the university. And Jack Coleman, a former student. He's a private investigator now." "Perfect. Reach out to them. I'll handle the legal side." The call ended, and Luke immediately contacted Miles. The older man answered on the second ring, warm concern in his voice. Within minutes, Miles had offered his full support, promising to protect Luke's position at the university. Then came the call to Jack. "Professor Elliot?" The young voice answered, cautious. "Jack, I need help. It's personal. Are you in?" A short pause. "Always." Luke didn't waste time. He laid it all out, the forgery, the theft, the pattern he'd uncovered about Ryan Wells. Jack listened without interruption. "Sounds like we've got a predator on our hands," he said finally. "I'll dig into his background, Let's see how many skeletons he's hiding. That evening, Luke made one last call to his sister, Ruby. Her familiar voice cracked with concern as he explained what had happened. "Oh, Luke, get over here. My guest room is yours. Stay as long as you need." Gratitude welled in his chest, briefly breaking through the numbness. He drove to her home, a modest two-story house on the outskirts of a quiet suburb. The warmth of her presence was the first comfort he had felt since everything fell apart. Later that night, they gathered around Ruby's dining table. Luke, Don, Miles, Jack, and Ruby. The documents were spread out like a battle map. Jack had already found 2 other women who had suffered under Ryan's manipulation. Don was preparing legal documents. Miles was drafting a formal statement to the university board. They were moving as one. And Luke? He wasn't alone anymore. The following days unfolded like a tightrope walk in a windstorm. Luke stayed low at Ruby's house, rarely leaving the guest room unless necessary. Every morning, he reviewed documents, cross-checked records, updated timelines, and coordinated silently with the small group now standing beside him. There was no room for missteps. One wrong move could alert Emma or Ryan to his growing efforts. And they were already dangerous. Jack Coleman, ever resourceful, had uncovered additional victims, 3 more women, each with similar tales of sudden romance, manipulated finances, and emotional devastation. The stories were disturbingly alike. Ryan Wells moved like a virus through lives, leaving ruin behind and walking away richer every time. But Jack's most critical move came late one night. Pacing just outside Ryan's office building, he called Luke in a hushed voice. "Cleaning crew just left. If I'm going to plant that device, it's now or never." Luke's heart hammered as he replied, "Do it, but be careful." Then came the waiting. 1 hour, then 2. Luke was about to redial when his phone lit up. "I got in," Jack said. "But there's a problem." "What happened?" "Emma and Ryan showed up while I was still inside. I had to hide. I overheard something you're not going to like." A long pause. "They're planning to have you declared mentally unstable. A full guardianship petition. They'll claim you're erratic, paranoid, fit for institutionalization." Luke's mind raced. It was more than a power grab now. They weren't just trying to steal from him, they wanted to erase him. If the petition succeeded, he would lose all legal authority over his own life. His evidence, his voice, his truth, it would all be dismissed as delusion. "Did they see you?" Luke asked. "No, but I dropped something. A university pin. Could tie me back." Luke cursed under his breath. "Get out of there. We'll fix it later." That night, sleep refused to come. He reviewed every possibility, every contingency. They were escalating fast. He had to be ready. By sunrise, the phone rang again. It was Dawn. "They filed it," Dawn said without preamble. "Emergency guardianship petition. Emma's lawyers claim you're emotionally unstable, suffering from delusions, unfit to manage your affairs." "On what grounds?" Luke asked, gripping the phone tighter. "Behavioral observations. Neighbors said you left your house late at night in a distressed state. They've submitted statements and anonymous complaints." "That's when I left after confronting her," Luke muttered. "They're using your caution against you," Dawn replied. "But we'll fight it. First, we respond to the petition. Then we prove you're of sound mind. But Luke, you need to be seen acting normally. Go to work. Keep calm. No erratic behavior. We need to kill this narrative." Luke understood. There would be no hiding in shadows anymore. His silence could be weaponized just as easily as his voice. He had to control the story. That afternoon, he returned to the university. Miles Harper met him at the door, ushering him into the faculty lounge, away from curious eyes. Miles had already begun preparing a public statement of support. His presence alone served as a stabilizing force. "We need a move," Luke said. "Something bold. Something that puts Ryan on the defensive." He had a plan. Later that day, a call was made. Luke, his voice carefully measured, reached out directly to Ryan. It was a gamble, but it worked. Ryan, ever the opportunist, couldn't resist the bait. "I've heard about your little discovery," he said smoothly. "Let's talk. I believe there's a business opportunity here." Luke proposed a meeting, private, casual. The university's faculty lounge, quiet and secluded. Ryan agreed, never suspecting the trap waiting for him. 20 minutes later, Luke stood alone in the lounge, a hidden microphone secured beneath his collar, his heartbeat steady. The door opened, and Ryan strode in with polished confidence, his designer suit practically gleaming under the ceiling lights. They sat. Ryan leaned in, spinning fantasies of development deals, ancient land ripe for profitable transformation, and promises of wealth for Luke, if he kept quiet. He mentioned relocating artifacts, cutting through red tape, and creative solutions for difficult permits. Luke remained calm, asked just enough questions to let Ryan dig his own grave. Eventually, Ryan slid a paper across the table, figures, projections, and a quiet offer of compensation. Luke glanced at it but didn't need to read. The tape was rolling, every word captured. The moment Ryan leaned closer to emphasize the scope of their arrangement, the door burst open. Don entered, flanked by 2 detectives. "Ryan Wells, you're under arrest for attempted bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and additional charges pending investigation." The developer's expression froze, but Luke saw the flicker of fear in his eyes before the mask cracked. Ryan snarled as he was cuffed. "You'll regret this, Elliot." But Luke simply watched in silence. One piece had fallen, and Emma would be next. The morning after Ryan's arrest, Luke stood behind a pane of 2-way glass at the local precinct, his expression unreadable. On the other side, Emma sat in a sterile interrogation room, her posture rigid, her face carefully composed. She looked more like someone preparing for a press conference than a criminal suspect. But beneath the control there were cracks. The detective slid a folder across the table, printouts of emails, account transfers, digital trails too clear to ignore. "Care to explain these?" the detective asked. Emma didn't flinch. "This is absurd. I don't know anything about these accusations." But her mask began to falter. Behind the glass, Don stood beside Luke, arms crossed. "This is working. The more she denies, the deeper she sinks." Luke said nothing. His focus was locked on the woman who had once been the center of his world. Now she looked like a stranger. Everything moved quickly after that. Don filed for emergency divorce and asset protection. Miles Harper submitted a formal statement to the university board, defending Luke's character and reinforcing his academic standing. Jack provided a compiled dossier of Ryan's history, cross-state fraud, false identities, ruined families. The evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. News had traveled fast. Media trucks lined the street, and reporters hovered near the entrance. Luke entered through a side door, avoiding the flashing cameras. His allies were already seated. Ruby, firm and supportive. Don, confident. Miles, composed. Jack, focused. Luke took the stand first. He recounted everything. The storage unit, the forged will, Emma's veiled threats, the financial discrepancies, and the trap set for Ryan. His voice didn't shake. His hands stayed still. Every detail was deliberate, every pause intentional. He wasn't just telling his story, he was reclaiming it. The opposing counsel tried to discredit him, suggesting he was paranoid, emotionally unstable, grasping at conspiracies. "Dr. Elliot," the lawyer began, voice tinged with mock concern, "isn't it true you abandoned your home in the middle of the night? That you've made a series of irrational decisions since discovering this so-called will?" Luke met his gaze with calm precision. "I left my home to protect myself. The irrational behavior was not mine, but theirs." He gestured toward Emma, who sat with arms folded, eyes narrowed. "And the so-called will bore my forged signature. That's not speculation. It's documented." The courtroom murmured, and the judge called for silence. Then came the twist no one expected. Ryan, desperate, turned on Emma mid-trial. "It was her idea," he shouted during cross-examination. "She approached me, said she was tired of her husband, bored, wanted a new life. Emma's expression broke for the first time. You liar. You seduced me. You pushed the whole plan. What followed was chaos. The courtroom erupted as they began hurling accusations at each other. Loud, raw, unfiltered. The judge's gavel hammered repeatedly, struggling to restore order. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the truth not in evidence, but in the unraveling of the accused. Emma and Ryan, once so composed and calculated, were now revealed as reckless, self-serving manipulators, each willing to destroy the other for their own escape. It didn't take long. The jury returned swiftly with a unanimous verdict. Guilty. The judge's sentence was firm and final. 15 years. No parole for 10. Luke didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he exhaled, deep and steady, as if he'd been holding his breath for months. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled. Reporters called out his name, cameras flashed. He stepped up to the microphones flanked by Don and Miles. Justice was served today, he began, his voice even. But I don't stand here in victory. I stand here in survival. What happened to me could happen to anyone. And if you've been manipulated, deceived, or silenced, don't give up. The truth always finds its way. He stepped away without taking questions. Further back, Ruby waited. She gave him a small, proud smile, the kind only family can offer in quiet moments of relief. That night, Luke sat at her kitchen table with the rest of the team. The energy was subdued but content. They weren't just closing a chapter, they were stitching the wound. Miles raised a glass of water, his usual reserve briefly breaking. To the end of deception, Jack added, and the start of something new. They clinked glasses. No fanfare, no victory speech, just silence. Peace. Later, Luke stood alone outside, the cool night air settling around him. The storm was over, but the rebuilding of his life, his trust, his sense of self was only beginning. The trial was over, but the echoes of its chaos lingered. Luke stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, his figure still against the morning light. Around him, photographers packed away their cameras and journalists dictated summaries into their recorders. The noise was beginning to fade, replaced by something quieter, calm, cautious, and unfamiliar. The verdict had been decisive. Emma and Ryan were gone, stripped of their polished veneers, exposed as architects of deception. And yet Luke didn't feel triumphant. What coursed through him wasn't victory, but clarity. The war had been necessary, but now came something more difficult, the aftermath. Inside, Don was finalizing the paperwork. The divorce would be complete within days. Asset recovery had already begun. With the court's findings on fraud and conspiracy, most of the stolen funds would return to Luke's control. But some damage could never be reversed. Time lost, trust broken, the scar of betrayal. Miles Harper approached quietly, his tone gentle. We're submitting the university board's final statement this afternoon. Your position is secure, Luke. You'll return whenever you're ready. Luke nodded slowly. I appreciate that, but I think I need to work. Not just to stay busy, because I want to. Miles smiled, brief and genuine. Then come back on your terms. Later that day, Luke returned to Ruby's house. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh linen welcomed him. She had already set the dining table with leftovers, pretending not to have overprepared. You're not eating enough, she said without looking at him. I will. Just give me a minute. He stepped outside and stood on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against his face. Carried no threats now, only air, clean and quiet. He checked his phone. A single message from Jack. Drinks tonight? First round's on me. Luke smiled. He replied, see you at 8. That evening, they gathered at a quiet corner bar. Jack, Don, Miles, and Ruby. The lighting was low, the atmosphere unassuming. They didn't speak much about the case. It didn't need to be rehashed. What mattered now was that it was over. Jack lifted his glass. To not letting the bastards win. Laughter rippled around the table. It wasn't loud or celebratory. It was the kind of laugh that comes after holding your breath too long. For the first time in months, Luke felt it, the beginning of normal. Over the next few weeks, he rebuilt slowly. He returned to campus, not all at once, just a few lectures at first. Students welcomed him with awkward smiles and cautious curiosity. Gossip had circulated, of course, but the truth had emerged louder. Miles made sure of that. The department stood behind Luke. And in academia, loyalty still meant something. He also worked closely with Don to help pursue civil cases against Ryan's other victims. His testimony helped more than just himself. It opened doors for others who had been swindled and silenced. That, perhaps, became the most unexpected reward. Knowing that his suffering had paved the way for someone else's justice. His evenings were quieter. Sometimes he would walk through his old neighborhood, not to reclaim the house but to understand it. The lawn was overgrown now, the windows lifeless. Emma's version of their life had been curated like a museum, but without her, the illusion had collapsed. He felt no attachment anymore. It wasn't home. Instead, he found solace in smaller places. Ruby's kitchen, his office at the university, the dusty corners of the museum where he once lost himself in ancient texts and relics. These were the pieces he chose to keep. One morning, he returned to the same storage unit where it had all started. The wooden box was still there. He opened it not to find new evidence, but to confront the artifact that had changed everything. Inside was the forged will, now an official exhibit in the case file. He didn't touch it. Didn't need to. It had served its purpose. On his way out, he closed the door gently and handed the key back to the facility manager. He wouldn't be coming back. That afternoon, Luke stood before a class of first-year students. He held a piece of broken pottery, discussing civilizations long gone. The irony wasn't lost on him. History had always fascinated him because of how much it could hide. Now he understood how much it could reveal. He wasn't the same man who had opened that wooden box. He had been dismantled and rebuilt. As the lecture ended, a student lingered. "Professor Elliot, I just wanted to say, thanks for coming back. We all heard what happened. You didn't have to." Luke offered a faint smile. "I did. Some truths are worth showing up for." The student nodded and left. Luke remained a moment longer, letting the silence settle around him like armor. That evening, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Jack. "Next round's still on me. Bring Miles this time." Luke typed back, "Count me in." As he stepped out of the building, the sky above was clear. The air was crisp. The city moved on, unaware of his story, indifferent to his survival. And yet he walked forward, steady, unshaken. The war was over, and Luke Elliot had won.